I know. There.
All right. So we're going to get started. Thank you for joining me tonight, and thank you for trusting me on this journey.
Two different things. With you first, what's going on?
No, I mean, look, as I said in my email and as I said in the introduction, my goal here is to help you figure out what you believe. Okay. People are online here as well, so when somebody new joins, it's going to ding. Can you all hear me, by the way?
I can't, Bill.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So my goal here is to help you figure out what you believe. Okay, it's not to tell you what to believe, but sort of part of one of the things that I really firmly believe is that most American Jews have not given a lot of thought to what they actually believe about any of the various theological issues that confront us. And I think that that's a problem. I mean, how do I know? I mean, one of the reasons that I know this is because one of the questions that any rabbi will get fairly frequently is, Rabbi, do we believe that, or do we believe it? And you know, my response is always, I don't know. Do we? I mean, you're asking me what you believe. I mean, that's really, when you phrase it that way, it's not a good question. If you want to say, you know, does classical or traditional Judaism teach that? That's a different question. That's a question that I can answer, right? I can. If you ask me, do you believe that, blah, 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 that's also a question that I can answer. I may not want to, but I can. But I can't tell you what you believe, right? So, and I could tell you what to believe, but I don't. It's not the way I operate. So that is my goal here. So having said that, I'm going to plunge right into a writing exercise. And let me preface it by saying that the idea and the outlines of the question that I'm going to give you are from the late Rabbi Professor Neil Gilman of JTS. He was the dean of the rabbinical school for many years. He was a professor of philosophy. The closest thing in our generation to an official theologian of conservative Judaism, if there was one. Somebody I knew but not well. And a number of years ago at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention, they had mini courses that met for like 90 minutes a day for the 3 days of the convention. And he gave a mini course on precisely on this. Okay, so this is the question that he posed to us. I have paper, I have writing. So if somebody needs either of those, Barnaby, you need paper? And I'm also, what I'm going to do afterwards is I'm going to collect these, not to grade them, but to hold them for you, so that at the end of the class, you can look back and see if you would still give the same answer. Okay, it's a fascinating exercise. I mean, I don't know how many of you have, published much, but there is an online resource called the Berman Jewish Policy Archive. One of the things that it has is the archive of Shema magazine, which just recently closed up shop after about 50 years. And I published 3 articles in Shema in the 1980s. And, it's interesting for me to go back and look at what I wrote 30, 35 years ago. And, some of it is like, oh, yeah, I was pretty smart back then. But some of it is like, I can't believe I said that. Right? So, so it's a worthwhile exercise. So I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to hand it out. Those of you who are online, I can't hand it out to you. Sorry, but so hopefully you'll hear it well enough to be able to do it. Okay, so here is the case. A Jewish man and woman were married for several years and tried without success for a baby. They visited a number of different fertility centers, and finally the woman got pregnant, and after a relatively uneventful pregnancy gave birth to a full-term healthy baby girl. On the drive home from the hospital, a freak tragic accident occurred. A tree fell into another tree, which fell onto the right side of the family's car just as they were driving by. The mother and the baby were both killed instantly. The father was untouched. It's several months later, and the husband often lays awake all night wondering why this happened. He asks God for an explanation. Your task: write God's letter to the husband, explaining why this happened and why his wife and daughter are dead.
The more interesting question is, can you sue anybody?
Well, you, of course, would think that.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can.
Of the tree dead. They have taken it down.
Well, you're comprehensive.
It's a letter from. This is lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. You're not allowed to do bedtime stories from that. Go ahead. Pretty awful. You don't want us to write directly when questions you?
You can if you want to. That'd be fine. If that,
This is presuming that I exist, right?
I'm gonna ask to try and wrap it up in the next couple minutes. Does anybody want to share what they wrote? Anyone?
I don't mind.
Okay, please.
I said, this is what God would be saying. This wasn't anybody's fault. Nothing you or your wife ever did in your lives would be the reason for this tragedy to occur. It was just that the trees were too weak to be supported properly. The timing was, there was nothing you could have done to prevent this horrible accident. Even I am not omnipotent enough to have had any control over it.
First of all, you're a wonderful grandmother. You're a wonderful parent, you really are. I said, while man has some power to reason and understand, there are limits. It is important to honor the memory of your wife and a child. You need to go on living. Who lives and who dies are beyond human comprehension, especially when the cause is as random as this. I can't explain to you why this happens, but I have provided guidelines for you to continue your life. You can search for an answer, but if you just obsess as to why, you will never understand. Your friends and family, and my teachings and messages over the years can provide help. Use them.
Really?
Great.
So logical.
Yeah.
I hate reading in front of people. I really know this, but I am so sorry that this happened to you. I want you to know that although I am not responsible for that action, specifically, I am responsible for making sure that life will continue for you and that good things will happen. When you sing the Shema with your fellow congregants, you will know that I am there. I have built a structural scaffolding to the world that unfortunately does allow for bad things to happen, but they balance out with good things to form a structure, one that you cannot see, but you can feel in the form of love, even in non-traditional love. Love for your deceased wife and daughter, love of yourself that will reappear. There will be a tomorrow, and I will be there to ensure that love and other parts of the scaffolding of human existence remain solidly in place. I exist even for those hippie cultural Jews whose non-traditional identity seems to be based upon an existence as a non-believing person, and I am there for you. I have not forsaken you.
Anybody else? Mike.
So the question, so the answer, God would say, wow, I'm so sorry that happened. It was terrible. A freak of an occurrence that should never have happened. I'm crying with you. Words could never provide adequate comfort. But as to why, sorry, but don't look at me. I don't micromanage. Life happens. The very idea you're turning to me in your hour of need is the best either of us can hope for. But I think you know that. The fact that I'm answering you, but am I? Or are you relying on me as you deal with your grief? Together, we can try to deal with this and hopefully get past it.
Anybody else? All right. So what I'm going to hand out something else, and Bill and Gail, I'll send this to you by email tomorrow.
Yeah. And destruction?
No.
Okay.
This is actually, Mike, you have seen this already. Okay, you have. It's called the Faith Interview. It was produced by Rabbi Dr. Professor. I know a lot of people named Rabbi Dr. Professor.
Sounds like someone from South America.
Yeah, or German.
Yeah.
Herr Professor Rabino. Stephen Brown, who teaches at JTS. And when I was doing my certificate in Jewish educational technology, he supervised our capstone project, where we had to do, use technology in education. And so I arranged for several of our adult congregants and several of our then teen congregants to do this together and film it while they did it. You
with the kids.
Yeah. So I'm not going to have you answer this right now because I want to move on. But I would say that at some point in the next week or so, you should ask yourself and answer these questions. And I have to say that when I did this as part of my capstone project at JTS, I actually thought by and large the teens gave much better answers than the adults did. What?
More honest.
Less of a filter.
Yeah.
More honest, less of a filter, but
More innocent.
well, no, I think actually more theologically sophisticated.
Really?
I mean, two different people said adults, okay, and it blew my mind, okay. Trying to reconcile the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent God with the reality of things like this tree by saying, well, God is very busy and can't control everything that happens in the world anymore because there's so many people and so much going on, and God is just very busy. And with all due respect, to me, that's just an insane answer, right? I mean, God, if God is omnipotent, then he can't be too busy to pay attention to everything that's happening everywhere. It's just absurd.
What did the kids say?
Well, the kids all had answers that are variations kind of on what you all said. That, in other words, they don't So all right. So let me.
So we're more like the kids than the adults.
Yeah, I think. No, but I think that's a better place to be, frankly. All right. So I'm going to run through a historical overview of Jewish views of God, and particularly those of you who studied with me before know that in my opinion, learning happens in the tangents and digressions. Although I don't want to linger on any one particular idea and discuss, is this good, is it bad, does it work, because there's just too much to cover, and we will get back to that at some point. Okay, but and some of this is sort of gross overgeneralization, but that's what I do. So the traditional biblical view of God is, as I said, that God is omnipotent, right? That God is benevolent, and that God is omniscient, right? God can do everything, God knows everything, and God is good. All right, now, God is also a God of justice, so that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to people, right? But when bad things happen to people, it's because they deserve it. Yeah.
And just to interrupt, that was the thing that when I read this, that I kept thinking about. Like there's no background information about these people.
Right.
Like what happens if this guy was abusing his wife? Or what happens in a case where, it's still, the baby wouldn't deserve it, but in other words, there's so much else that you could, if you took your viewpoint there of the biblical view, that maybe in some way could justify at least part of the tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
If it was a punishment that he had done to the family.
Right, but then you'd have to ask yourself the question, why is he being punished through the death of his wife?
Right.
Right. Having said that, and this is a great segue to the book of Job, right? Because already by the book of Job, we're seeing, people are starting to, the world doesn't always work that way. World doesn't always work that way, right? And this is precisely what happens to Job, right? His kids get killed, his wife gets killed, right? Because God, has a bet with Satan about whether Job is gonna stay faithful or not, right? And the ultimate conclusion of the book of Job is basically, you don't understand, right? You don't understand, you're not capable of understanding, right? If you understood the way I worked in the world, you would be me, and you're not me, right? I'm God, you're not. And that's, so you can look for an answer, but you're never going to find one, right? Now, most, I think, the general sort of scholarly consensus about in history of religion is that the idea of the afterlife also developed as a response to our perception that good people suffer and bad people prosper, right? And I would say that in the Torah itself, there is no afterlife. There's this conception of Sheol, which is kind of a shady place where souls linger, but it's not heaven, it's not hell. There's no reward and punishment after death in the Torah, but that develops in later books of the Bible. And as I said, I believe precisely, because that's where the score will be even, right? Yes, you're a good person, and horrible things are happening to you now, but this world is just a corridor to the real world, which is the afterlife, and it's going to be awesome, right? And now I'm gonna skip ahead a couple of millennia to Spinoza.
Who I mentioned the other day.
Yeah, you
Well, that's
mentioned
what-
him,
yeah.
and Barnaby. Two people mentioned Spinoza to me this week, so so it's obviously fate that we.
For sure.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a late Latin.
Right. All right. So, but Spinoza, in many ways, I think, is the first modern Jewish theologian. I mean, even though he wasn't working in a specifically Jewish vein, and he was excommunicated by the Sephardic community of Amsterdam. But and I think there have been movements every now and then to sort of formally revoke his excommunication. But Spinoza, first of all, he says that we don't develop our own ideas. Ideas always reflect a certain external cause, an external reality, right? Like you didn't invent the idea of a tree, right? You know about a tree by seeing a tree or hearing somebody describe to you a tree, right? So if we have the idea of God, then God must exist, because we can't create an idea out of our own imagination, right? In other words, the fact that we have a God concept proves that God exists. Okay? Now, I mean, I'm not necessarily explaining this well. I'm not saying that you should buy it. But, okay. So, but the question is, for who when we say God, what do we mean? Okay, and Spinoza says that God is the sum of the natural and physical laws of the universe, and certainly not an individual entity or creator. Okay, God is the only substance in the universe. Everything is a part of God. Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. Okay, so, in some sense, some of these ideas that God and the universe are the same thing were present in Kabbalah before Spinoza. Leitatar panui mine. There is no place in the world that is absent of God. Okay, or that phrase that we have in the Kedusha, Malo kol haaretz kavodo, right? Which we normally translate as the whole earth or the whole universe is full of God's glory, but it can be read differently to say the whole universe is God, right? And I've taught some of this in various drushot and so on. So that's Spinoza. Okay. And then, so Spinoza was kind of at the beginning of the Enlightenment, right? And then, so, even when we say modernity, right? It's hard to define exactly what modernity means, but these ideas of enlightenment, of scientific progress, of individual freedom and autonomy, which arose in the 16 and 1700s, right? So, many Jews, particularly in Germany, presented Judaism as essentially ethical monotheism, right? The belief in one God is equivalent to the belief in a single source of moral law, right? So in that sense, many of these ideas are not sharply distinct one from another. They resemble each other. And Hermann Cohen also originally was concerned mostly with God as ethics, very rationalistic, but he later took a more traditional turn and became more concerned with the reality of God than the idea of God. And then Cohen's two sort of most significant students in terms of being still studied and still remembered were Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber. And Rosenzweig and Buber, first of all, they worked together. They knew each other, they worked together. They jointly retranslated the Bible from Hebrew into German, trying to capture the grammar and the syntax better. So for Rosenzweig, God cannot be known through rational inquiry. God is encountered existentially, right? These encounters amount to personal revelations, right? So for Rosenzweig and Buber are both existentialists, right? That you know God by encountering God, not by thinking about God. Whereas for Buber, and this is where Buber and Rosenzweig differ, Buber believes that you come to know God through your relationships with other people. Okay. Yeah, the I-thou relationship. Okay, and I-thou requires a certain explanation because, I think a lot of people don't really know what thou means in English because it's fallen out of use, right? But many languages have a formal and informal address, like Spanish has usted and tú, right? And so, what? French, yeah, French, and so does German. Okay, and so thou is actually the informal English. Thou is the English equivalent of the Spanish or French too. And interestingly enough, in all of those languages, God is addressed in the informal rather than the formal, as if God is our buddy, right? And so when, we had the older, like when we had either the Silverman prayer book, if you grew up conservative, or the Union prayer book, if you grew up Reform, or probably the Boxer and other prayer books where God is always, thou hast vouchsafed unto us laws and commandments, right? But that's meant to be informal. It comes off for us as very formal because the language has evolved. Okay, so the I thou is actually is knowing another intimately. Okay, and by intimately I don't necessarily mean sexually, but so that for Buber there are two modes of relationship. There is the I-it relationship and the I-thou relationship, right? And we can treat people as it's also, as instrumental. In fact, frankly, most of our relationships with other people are I-it relationships, right? I mean, you go to the pharmacy And you could be very nice to the pharmacist, right? But you're dealing with the pharmacist because you need your meds. And
Transactional.
right. And the pharmacist is dealing with you because he or she is drawing a salary and that's what they're paid to do, right? So most of our relationships are I-it, and that's just the way it is, right? But occasionally we have an I-thou relationship, which for Buber is not limited to relationship with another person. Okay, you can have an I-thou relationship with a work of art. You can have an I-thou relationship with a tree. Now, how does the tree have an I-thou relationship with you? This I can't know, but right. But if I were to kind of sum it up, even though this is not from Buber, but rather from the Broadway play Les Miserables, right? To love another person is to see the face of God, right? And that the difference between God and humans is that God is the eternal thou, right? God is always a thou. God is always with us. God will never let us down. God will never disappoint us. Now, we are capable of treating God in an instrumental or transactional way, right? But for Buber, that's idolatry, right?
On television every Sunday.
Yeah, no, but that's idolatry. That's not the real God. The real God is always a thou. Okay, so that's, and and I have to say that I think for most of us, aspects of all of these make some sense. Certainly to me, both Buber and Rosenzweig make a lot of sense. All right, and I think in a certain sense, particularly Rosenzweig, who is not nearly as well known as Buber, partly because Rosenzweig died very young. He had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and he communicated eventually only by blinking his eyes, and then not at all. He died. I don't know exactly how old, but he was quite young, like in his 30s, I think. Whereas Buber was able to leave Germany when Hitler came to power, but before the death camps were in operation, and went to live in Israel. And he was a professor at the Hebrew University, and he died I think in 1965. So he's so for most but not all of us, he's our contemporary, right? Because the definition of contemporary means that you were alive at the same time, right? And most of us were alive. Most of us in this room were alive when Buber died.
But his point, he's existential and he's religious, especially in a traditional sense. And that really is a big deal. There are Catholics, I know that, who have some existential overtones.
Right.
That's really quite a thing, I think.
Right, but where Buber and Rosenzweig differed is that, Rosenzweig became more and more traditionally observant as he got older. Whereas Buber felt that the I-thou relationship could never generate law. Okay, and he was a complete antinomian. All right, he strongly believed in God, but he didn't observe anything. He was totally non-observant, right? Whereas Rosenzweig, and this gets more into the idea of mitzvot than God per se, but for Rosenzweig, mitzvot occur when you hear a particular mitzvah addressed personally to you by God. Okay? So that, in theory, the whole package is binding, but God may be addressing you with only some of them
Right.
at this moment, but you should never discard the possibility that God might address you differently sometime in the future. Okay, so for example, as
Talk to you?
well,
or-
in that encounter, how that happens, I don't really know. I don't think
Speaks to
it's,
you.
I don't think, yeah, but I don't think Rosenzweig means verbally.
Like you
but-
just have a moment and
You have a moment, yeah.
you feel it.
But, when he was starting to become more observant and somebody asked him if he put on tefillin, his answer was not yet. Okay. And and in that sense, I think, if I had somebody studying for conversion and that was the answer that they gave me, that would be fine, right? Because because in order to convert, you have to accept Kabbalah ol HaMitzvot. You have to accept the idea that the mitzvot are obligatory. Doesn't mean you have to be presently observing all of them, right? But you certainly cannot a priori reject any of them, right? So if I asked about tefillin and the person said, well, I don't put them on yet, but I recognize that I might, men or women,
You
right?
have the same question.
Yeah, it depends also on the age of the woman. I would think that, women or females or girls who grow up in an egalitarian conservative movement should be asked the same question, right? But the reality is, and that's a different issue, the reality is that we don't have the same expectations. I know in day schools and in Ramah, it's really hard to get girls to put on tefillin or to pray with talitot, and we see that even here, where girls have their bat mitzvah and they wear a talit for their bat mitzvah, and then when they come to services, they don't wear a talit anymore, but the boys still do. But we're getting far
Do
afield.
the girls here get a choice?
No. Not for their bat
That's
mitzvah.
what I mean.
Yeah.
So why are you surprised? They have to show up. It's part of showing up.
Right. But they should do it whenever they come, not just for their bat mitzvah. And many of them don't.
Only if they bought into it when they were.
Right. So part of that is our own failure of education. I cop to that. Yes, Sue.
So I guess maybe I don't really know that much about Martin Buber, but if his views were so kind of extreme as far as, the nature of God, and then he didn't feel like any of the observances were important, what was it that held him to Judaism? Why didn't he go the Unitarian route?
It was his peoplehood. And it was not just peoplehood, but it was tradition. In other words, he loved the Bible, and he wrote a lot about the Bible. In fact, he called his own approach biblical humanism. But this is something that Israelis understand instinctively, and American Jews find very hard to get, right? Because we have grown up, right? Everything has a category, right? Everything fits into a certain pigeonhole, right? And the pigeonhole that Judaism fits into in America is religion, right? And it would be bizarre to say I'm Catholic and an atheist, right? I'm Protestant and an atheist. I'm Muslim and an atheist. If I would be beyond bizarre, it'd be probably dangerous. Right? But to me, perhaps because I've lived in Israel too, somebody to say I'm fervently, passionately Jewish and I'm an atheist makes perfect sense. I don't share their atheism, but it makes perfect sense to me, right? Because there's so much more to being Jewish than religion.
The ethnicity in the background.
The ethnicity in the background and the history and and all of these are sources. What? Culture. All of these are sources of identity. Okay.
I once sold a house to a guy who self-identified as an Orthodox atheist.
Mm-hmm. Well, all right. So,
A strict atheist then.
Strict atheist.
Yeah, he kept kosher.
No, I mean, he and his family went to an Orthodox school,
uh-huh.
and he was.
Well, okay. So in that's kind of a New York non-observant Orthodox.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they belong to an Orthodox shul, but they're not
So
personally.
much of what we do, we're handed,
Right.
and then we are surrounded by, and then it becomes a culture, and there's a religion someplace around there, but it's completely up to us how much of that piece of who we are and what we do
Right.
we sign on to.
But
So,
in Israel, you can be very Jewish and not religious at all.
Right.
Because you're speaking the language, you're with the people of your people,
You're living, just being there is enough.
All right. So you want to hear a story? Or do you want to go on? All right. So I'll tell you a story. So I had a professor in rabbinical school, Jacob J. Petachowski. And Petachowski was an interesting guy in a lot of ways. He was born in Germany. His father was, I think, an Orthodox rabbi. Petachowski went to London as a young man, then came to the United States, became a Reform rabbi, but on the traditional wing of Reform Judaism, and was very highly thought of at the Jewish Theological Seminary. So every few years, he would get a job offer from the seminary, and then would show the figure that JTS was offering him to the dean of HUC, and then he would get a raise. But Petachowski, for a very brief time, was a pulpit rabbi in Washington, Pennsylvania, okay, where there's only one shul, and like many small cities where there's only one shul, it has to really satisfy everybody, okay. But Petachowski being German, and this was in the 1950s, okay, so that having an organ in the shul was not necessarily considered untraditional. I mean, there were conservative shuls that had organs as well, and even some Orthodox ones where they insisted that the organist had to be a non-Jew or whatever. But anyway, so he put an organ into the shul, okay. And one Saturday afternoon, a congregant knocks on his door, smoking a big cigar, and says, "Rabbi, I need you to take the organ out of the shul." And Petachowski says, "Why?" He says, "Because I'm Orthodox and I don't like it." And Petachowski says, "Well, if you're Orthodox, first of all, put out the cigar."
Was it Shabbat?
Yeah. Second of all, close your store on Shabbat, and then I'll talk to you.
Yeah.
Which may explain why he wasn't a pulpit rabbi for very long. But, this guy obviously felt that you could smoke on Shabbos and keep your store open on Shabbos and still be Orthodox, because it was more was more a sort of sociological affiliation than a theological one. Okay, so Buber wrote. Let's move on to Kaplan, Mordechai Kaplan. Okay, Mordechai Kaplan, who also a contemporary of possibly not quite all of us. He lived to be 102 years old. He was born in 1881 and he died in 1983. And he was the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, although he was a professor at JTS. And he was also the founder of Young Israel, which is the Orthodox synagogue movement. So he had a foot in a lot of different camps. But you know, the joke was that for Reconstructionists, right, there is no God and Kaplan is his prophet. Because Kaplan was often accused of being an atheist. Okay, Kaplan said that he was not an atheist. He was a naturalist. He did not believe in a supernatural God. He did not believe in an interventionist God. But it is the God for him is the power within nature that makes salvation possible. Okay, now then you have to ask yourself, what exactly does salvation mean, right? And I can't really answer that, right? But so I'm gonna wind up, you know, with the Holocaust, right? Because the Holocaust, you know, personally.
He starts with the tree falling, ends
Right.
with the Holocaust.
Right. Well.
Careful, we're going.
Right. No, but I think after the Holocaust, it is impossible to believe in an omnipotent, benevolent, omniscient God. Right? That you have to jettison either benevolence or omnipotence. Unless you're a Satmar Hasid. I mean, the Hasidim absolutely have no theological problem with the Holocaust, right? Because you sin, you get punished. I mean, and it's not an individual, it's a collective thing, right? Israel sins, Israel gets punished, right? Well, what did Israel do? Well, Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Modern Orthodox Judaism, Zionism, etc., 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 so that the Holocaust is God's punishment for all those things. It's consistent. It's monstrous, but it's consistent, right? But unless you believe that the Holocaust was a deserved punishment for the Jewish people, then I think it's impossible, but I'll modify it and say very hard to believe in a God who is both omnipotent and benevolent. Right now, one more sentence and then all right. You could say that we simply don't understand. Right? That somehow the Holocaust does not challenge God's benevolence and omnipotence. We don't understand why God let it happen. All right? You could say that. You know, and then there are theologies, which again I find monstrous, that, you know, yes, we had the Holocaust, but then God paid us back by giving us Israel. Right, and they're, you know,
Talk about transaction.
well, yeah, but I mean, beyond that, I mean, I think it's almost a Christian idea that, you know, because it's death and then resurrection. Right. But yeah, now Sue.
Well, I was going to actually travel along that same road because I was wondering about the thinking that the Holocaust wasn't a punishment so much as a push, that the thinking that through the 2,000 years, so many things happened to the Jewish people, and we never got our act together to get to Israel. And if, in other words, if you look at the thinking, like the super Orthodox that are there don't accept the state of Israel because they feel like it should have been, God that came down and actually gave it to us, and we moved in before. So if you have the thinking that it's okay to go there because you're sort of fulfilling God's promise and you don't have to wait for him to actually come down in person and say go, then on that same line of thinking of that we can fulfill this by going, then you could sort of think that maybe he was trying to get people to do this earlier and finally just sort of threw his hands up in the air and like, what am I going to do kind of thing. Like, are they ever going to get their act together and go there? Not so much as a punishment.
Right.
But I've heard that before. And as horrible as it is, it's like, unless you come up with an explanation like that, it's hard to be able to deal with it.
Right. I mean, I will say that in the mid and late 40s, there were definitely some Zionists who said precisely that. I mean, they didn't attribute it to God because they were mostly secularists, right? But this is sort of nature's way, the universe's way of telling us that that we have to end the exile and get back home, right? The only theologian, if you can call him that, who says that today, and he still says it today, is John Hagee, right? The evangelical pastor who's the head of Christians United for Israel, and he said that explicitly many times, that the Holocaust was God's way of getting the Jewish people back to the Promised Land. Again, to me, that's sort of monstrous. I mean, if frankly, in other words, when I say it's monstrous, if that's the way God works, then I don't want anything to do with that God. That's what I mean when I say monstrous.
I've just heard that before.
Yeah.
But one of the things, and it's a twist, but it's not. You talk about the Holocaust. You're talking about pure evil. There's a serious evil component to it, and evil exists in the world, and it certainly existed before. And since the Holocaust, we've had Cambodia, we've had Rwanda, we've had Bosnia, we've had My Lai, we've had many examples of, and that to me is, how do you deal with that? I know how Milton did it, but that on a metaphorical level. But realistically, how do you account for that kind of evil?
Well, look, I mean, I can't answer that, obviously, right? But the only thing that I would say is that, yes, in other words, when people ask me why the Holocaust happens, why it happened is very explicable, okay? Right. Hitler and his bunch decided to kill the Jews. The German people said, okay, fine. And then the rest of the world sat and watched, right? And that has nothing to do with God, right? But
it could.
But the fact that God didn't intervene to stop it,
right?
That's the challenge, right? Not that people perpetrated the Holocaust, but that God didn't intervene to stop it is a challenge either to God's omnipotence. Well, God didn't stop it because he couldn't stop it, or he didn't stop it because he chose not to, in which case there goes his benevolence. Barnaby.
God isn't always going to send that angel who's going to tell you, do not lay a hand on that board.
Right.
And again, this far from it from me that I should try to speculate into the why of the Holocaust. And what you said, like the world stood by idly, and the Germans said, okay, that it speaks to at least my personal perspective, especially being colored by so many trials over my life. It was a trial for the world, and it failed miserably.
Sure. No, absolutely. I mean, I think, look, I mean, the Holocaust is an indictment of humanity at least as much as it is an indictment of God. You know, but nevertheless, I think personally, theology after Auschwitz has to be different than theology before Auschwitz. Okay, so it is now, wow, it's 9:08. So we're gonna pause here. I would actually be delighted to teach this again on Thanksgiving, but I think most of you would probably. So we will not meet 2 weeks from now. We will meet whatever the second Thursday in December is. So I would really, I mean, I don't necessarily need to collect your answers if you want to keep them, but please hold on to them so that we can look at them again at the end of the course and see, you know, if you still hold the same beliefs. All right, thank you.